talk about the Kalgoorlie Biplane. It was the first aeroplane built in Western Australia. In 1913, a group of young people in Kalgoorlie got together and talked about building an aircraft. They were well away from mainstream aviation. They were working on their own, and initially none of them had any experience whatsoever. A aeroplane was produced. It evidently handled very well. It had good handling characteristics, and it was flown by a very competent pilot. They had problems. The engine, which they got second-hand, didn't perform at all well and caused them endless problems. But they got over those. The learning curve was very steep. In those days there were no standards to follow, no industrial standards. They had to virtually do everything for themselves. It was in fact the first aircraft built and flown in Western Australia. So prior to the Kalgoorlie Biplane, only 2 aircraft had ever flown in Western Australia, and they were Joseph Hammond on January the 3rd, 1911, and in subsequent days he flew a few more flights and eventually clocked up somewhere near an hour's flying in Perth. The next person was 3 years later, in the middle of 1914, but by this time the Kalgoorlie group had already started work on their aircraft. Jones flew for about half an hour in Perth and then went to Kalgoorlie and flew for another half an hour up there. So while these gentlemen in Kalgoorlie were building their aeroplane, the total flying time in Western Australia was just over 2 hours. So that's how isolated they were. Jones visited Kalgoorlie, but prior to that, these group of young men who were motorcycle enthusiasts who used to go out riding the motorbikes on a Sunday afternoon. You know something about that, Ian, wouldn't you? You know, mining town, riding your motorbike over the dumps. And they talked of building this aeroplane in late 1913. They decided to proceed, and their ideas firmed up when Jack Gear joined their group. They wrote to England for some plans from the Royal Aircraft Establishment, and they used those as a guide for construction, although most of the plans that they used were redrawn by themselves, by the members of their group. They searched for an engine, they couldn't find one, and eventually they bought one from New South Wales, and it was an engine out of a Bristol box kite, one of the 2 that Hammond had brought to Australia in 1911. The bloke that owned the aeroplane had crashed it so many times that it was a total wreck, and the engine was very close to the same thing. So they got a very poor return for their investment there. The group consisted of tradesmen and apprentices, and they welded themselves into a very close-knit group. Jack Gear was the driving force in the group because he had worked at the Vickers factory in England. In fact, he worked for the Vickers Maxim factory. Vickers made machine guns, and Hiram Maxim was also mixed up in machine guns. And so that's where he had his experience. However, he'd also obtained a UK pilot licence in 1912, and he'd also worked as an instructor at the Aero School of Flying at Stoneham in England. He arrived in Fremantle in 1913, and soon after he moved to Kalgoorlie. And that's when he found these motorcyclists, and he was keen on motorcycling as well. And at that time, he was the only licensed pilot in Western Australia. The group got together, worked on their plans, and they started fabrication in a shop, a furniture shop or furniture factory owned by Mr. Welsman. The bits and pieces were produced there in wood, and later when they needed a bit more room, they moved to a building in Egan Street, and that's where I think this photo was taken as the aeroplane was constructed. The undercarriage was somewhat similar, evidently, to an Aero 500 series, and the tailplane, so someone tells me in some of the literature I've read, was similar to a Vickers biplane of 1912 also. To raise money for the venture, they formed the Kalgoorlie Aero Syndicate, and they kept the government departments informed of what they were doing. They applied for registration of their aircraft. They also communicated with the Defence Department to keep them abreast of what they were doing. So it was quite a professional outfit. They raised £500 from 20 shares at £25 each, and that was what they used for their construction. That's a photo of the gnome rotary engine, and the crankcase stayed still and the cylinders rotated around it. Heck of a gyroscopic mess at the front of the aeroplane, and there were many parts in it which were either at the end of their life or very close to it. In less than a year, that actually produced the aeroplane. Here it is in its near completed state in the Kalgoorlie Town Hall, and they got 300 people in on the first night to have a look at it, charging an admission fee. And each night of the week there were lectures on aviation to try and build up a bit of interest in what they were doing, because by this time they'd spent £700 on their aircraft. That's 14 members of the group, the syndicate, the Kalgoorlie Aero syndicate, and that shortish bloke there is Mr. Gear. This one here is Mr. Davidson, the Lord Mayor. They got pretty good support from the people of Kalgoorlie. As the aeroplane appeared to be a bit of a success, people came out of the woodwork to help them on their way. They didn't want to fly it in Kalgoorlie, they wanted to take it to Coolgardie, where out of the mainstream area and away from the public, they could test it, and they hoped to bring it back to Kalgoorlie and make some money on it and retrieve their investment. So off to Coolgardie they went, and on the 26th of May 1915, Jack Gear got in the aircraft and flew it across the racecourse at Coolgardie at a height of about 30 feet. He then went back, repeated it 3 more times, carrying a passenger each of those other times. On the 5th flight of the day, he took off and flew a wide circuit around the racecourse and landed successfully, and they considered the whole thing to be a bit of a master stroke. And it was, to produce an aeroplane and fly it without too many troubles at all. In fact, they were so pleased that they took it out to a paddock about 3 or 4 miles out of Coolgardie, called Bowes Paddock. It was a forestry department clearing, and they worked on it out there for a few more days, making minor adjustments to it, and then Gear flew it into Coolgardie and landed in the main street, in Bailey Street, taxied up to the Victoria Hotel and tied it to a veranda post. The publican was very pleased about this and invited he and his helpers in, and they were helpers, for a meal, free meal and drinks. He then, after lunch, left Coolgardie, took off and flew back to Bowes Paddock, where he spent a few more days test flying and making adjustments to it. Then came the time to take it to Kalgoorlie. They were going to fly it in, majestically land at the race course and let everyone know what they'd been up to. Bad luck. They got about halfway to Kalgoorlie, or Gear got halfway to Kalgoorlie, and the engine failed. Didn't have the benefit of wide roads. There were only tracks around the place in those days, traversed by horse and cart, no wide highways, no market gardens in the district, so he had to land it in the bush. Tipped up on the nose, didn't do a great deal of damage, broke the propeller and did a bit of damage to the wingtip. So he decided that they'd put it onto a jinker and take it back to Coolgardie and effect a few repairs on it. So they put it onto the jinker and the horses bolted. This is Bowes Paddock. That's where the engine failure took place, so they got halfway to Kalgoorlie. And that's what the aircraft was like after they picked up the pieces at Currawang. It was totally destroyed. So they really took the wreckage back to Kalgoorlie and took 4 months to build another aircraft. So they actually called the second one Kalgoorlie 2. I won't go through the rigmarole that they had to go through to get it to Kalgoorlie because it took them 8 days. They had another engine failure. They had a fuel cap come off and fuel was spraying all over the place. They had a wheel collapse on a takeoff and they had to get another wheel from Perth, which took a week to get up. So they had their problems. But finally, they got it to Kalgoorlie. And after some demonstration flights, they had it christened. Ooh, let's go back a bit. I lost it. Yeah, so the name, it was christened Kalgoorlie by the wife of the Lord Mayor, who was the man near the centre of that photograph where I showed you the members of the syndicate. They then decided that they'd bring the aircraft to Perth. They'd been communicating with the Ministry of, well, not the Ministry there, but the military people in Canberra and Melbourne was, I suppose, in those days. And they'd come over and had a look at it, inspected it. They said it was a very nice aeroplane, beautifully made. So they decided to bring it to Perth, and down it came, but they stopped at Northern on the way through. They had 2 days of flying there where they made a little bit of money, and they brought it to Perth December the 6th, 1915. They put on a demonstration for the Governor on December the 11th, but the public showed little interest. And by this time, they hadn't even recouped the amount of money that it took them to bring it from Kalgoorlie to Perth. The engine was giving problems, and so the project looked as if it was going to fold. There was a Mr. Pedro who lived in Perth, and he pestered Gear for a fly in the aeroplane. He followed him around and kept on asking, can I go for a fly? He went from Belmont to the Esplanade in Perth, and finally Gear gave in and took him for a fly. And he became the first passenger in an aircraft in Western Australia. Sorry, in Perth. There'd been lots of passengers in Kalgoorlie and in Coolgardie. The engine continued to give troubles. The syndicate ran out of money, and the propeller of the Kalgoorlie was given to Mr. Pedro, who took it away, and soon after that, Gear and the other members of the syndicate enlisted in World War I and went off to fight the war. Most of them had come from other states of Australia, so there was nothing to bring them back after the war, and so they went their separate ways. The Kalgoorlie was stored in the Union Maltings building in Palmerston Street, West Perth, where it just remained for years. No one took much interest in it, and it slowly deteriorated. It was dragged out in 1929 for the centenary celebrations, and it was in very poor shape. It was covered with calico and daubed with calciline to make it look reasonable. It had no wings, no propeller that had been given away. Tailplane was only partly there. It was a pretty disgusting display, really, for such a historic aeroplane. It was eventually given to the museum, and they didn't look after it either. They stored it outside, and Ted Fletcher told us about this in the previous talk. It eventually ended up in someone's backyard as junk. The propeller that was handed to Mr. Pedro ended up on the wall of the Alhambra bars. Anyone had a beer at the Alhambra bars in those early days? Yeah, quite a few of you. And you can imagine his sales pitch, can't you? I was the first passenger in Perth, and this was the propeller that took me into the air. Probably sold many beers on that. But in 1938, hotel was refurbished possibly, and he gave the propeller to the Royal Aero Club. 1939, World War II was upon us, and anything that belonged to the Aero Club was taken over by the RAAF, and things that were sacred to the Aero Club disappeared right, left and centre. And most people thought the propeller had been lost. So there's a bit of a summary on Jack Gear and what he did. Third pilot to fly in WA, built and flew the first machine, first to carry passengers in Western Australia. He flew 100 times more than Hammond and Jones put together. He served in World War I and attained the rank of captain. He died in Victoria in 1951. But I went to see Reg Atkins about 3 or 4 weeks ago. We got talking about the history of aviation. And he said, come into my shed, I've got something I should show you. So I went into the shed, and lo and behold, he said, what do you think of that? And I said, Reg, do you realise what you've got here? And he said, yeah, I do. He said, not many other people realise what it is. And I said, that's off the Kalgoorlie Biplane. And he said, yeah, I know. I said, who owns it? Where'd you get it from? He said, oh, it belongs to the Royal Aero Club. I said, what? Where's it been? And he said, well, in about 1980, he said, I found it under a bench with some other junk in the electrical workshop. And he said, I told the staff there they should look after it. He said, a few months later, it was still there. So he said, I communicated with the president at the time, who just happened to be his wife. And he said, I think I'll take this home for safekeeping. He took it home and stored it as best he could. And I was probably one of the first people to see it. But in the meantime, he'd communicated with the Aero Club, he'd done some research, and there was letters written as to the history of the propeller, so it wasn't a total mystery to the Aero Club that it was there. So, yeah, the propeller still exists. And John Douglas, how'd you like to come up and lift the veil? So for some of you elderly gentlemen and the nonagenarians, this propeller is probably 93 years old, constructed in 1915 by Mr. Frank Oldfield. And so we have two of the most important propellers in Western Australia, and possibly Australia. This one here for a Bristol tourer, which established the first airmail service in Australia, and this one which was attached to the first aircraft built in Western Australia. And the Kalgoorlie people claimed that it was the first aircraft built and flown in Australia. Maybe there's an argument attached to that, but it was very well made out of 6 sheets of Italian walnut laminated together and carved by Frank Oldfield in 1914 or 15. Thank you.